So let me again open it up to you all out there. And what I would like to, I think Andrew made a good point that, we have grouped a lot of individual ideas together into these broader categories, but there certainly are, and they are rather obvious ones. And maybe some people can talk about what they meant when they said, say, communications training. I talked about a science core, although that was probably more in the K through 12, but certainly could apply to communications training for scientists as well. That's partly, although I think I put only $1 billion, I think, into that one, just one coin here. But that's what I meant. But maybe you all can help me with any of these, really, what you specifically put up, because as I look at those, I can't see them from here, so I can't read them, but they obviously have more than, say, the 2 or 3 words that we wrote to sum them up on these cards. So feel free, anybody jump in what you meant when you voted for. We already know why Brooke voted for boundary organizations. And by the way, did you notice that although she got $35 billion here, she was already talking about getting $100 billion? That's the way Washington works, right? Anyway, anybody want to jump in on maybe some specific ideas on this? Where do we go from here? Are we reaching that time in the afternoon when people are getting tired?
Maybe I'll jump in. I guess I'm just curious in terms of, as a community, getting to actionable programmatic efforts. For example, if through all our different forums, if we all, set up, I know some people, there are pros and cons with this, just as an example, like a science cafe or a engagement process in their local community or their college or their center of business, and we arm people with at least maybe generic, online training or something. I mean, what is it that we could get out there that we could all partner together to go do? Is there something along those lines?
Maybe people could jump in from your point of view. Who would you like to partner with? I guess maybe be one question. Brooke?
Well, I have a corollary to your question, which relates a little bit to what Amanda kind of challenged us with when she sat down up there and said, why did you put money in each of these things? What were you hoping to achieve from that? And I feel like one of the things that's gotten us kind of hung up to really think about what are we going to do next as a group here and after our first day together last month was not having a clearly articulated goal for why we do this. But I also personally very much feel like many of us do it for different reasons, and that's okay, and that there are different goals for science communication. But that differentiation of goals is making it hard to have a conversation about how do we as a community move forward. And I don't know how to reconcile that. So it's maybe another question on top of your question to you all, because this is something that I feel like is a challenge we need to think about.
Well, one question is, we're having fake gold here. We're assuming that money can solve these problems. This might be something I'd love to hear from all, any of you that want to comment on that. Clearly throwing money, you can buy the nicest communication tools, technologies available. You can pour money into this, our #1 choice or any of these choices. We've seen, to our dismay, in the last, several years, a lot of programs that set out to do good and got a lot of funding didn't achieve some of the aims that they set out, whether you're talking about educational aims, many other, and we found the limitations actually. I mean, we're a very wealthy country. I mean, we don't always talk that way, but it's interesting. The 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, the LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, announced 50 years ago, in 1964. We still have people. In fact, the percentage of people in poverty has not gone down very much, but we put a lot of money into that, and that's a little off topic for science communication, but maybe people can talk about that. I mean, we would all like to have bigger budgets, but is that really the solution?
David, this is Kai. I'm wondering if I could pick up on Erica's challenge to kind of join the conversation, in a kind of self-conscious way about our scientific background. When we talk about infrastructure, I think that there is the word that comes to my mind is shovel ready. And are there things, common goals across these various aims that we share? And honestly, I think that's something that I'm not too sure about beyond saying that I think there's agreement about some things like boundary organizations that need to be nurtured. But the other thing that we might do about this is to ask ourselves, there are a lot of different audiences and approaches here. How would we run a test of them against each other so that we learn better what kind of infrastructure we actually want to have? Because we're not going to be able to turn these the play money into real money anytime soon. So while we're waiting, why don't we spend that time learning a little bit more about what's actually going on? And I wonder if that might be a productive direction to spend a few minutes talking about.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great.
I was Dennis Schatz from the National Science Foundation. Thinking about this, boy, there's just so many issues that come up. I think the one thing, so I'm going to just list a number of things that come to mind, and they're not necessarily all connected. There certainly have been great programs out there. NSF funded the graduate program, I can't remember what it's called now, but they had funded graduate students from many universities to go out and teach in schools. GK-12, thank you, the GK-12 program. That got ended because NSF decided it didn't want to have programs that continued for a long period of time that were around delivery versus doing research. But that had a mixed impact because of the issue of training for the graduate students. In some cases, they got very good training. In other cases, they were essentially thrown to the K-12 classroom and said, do good work, learn from the teachers. So I think there's, the first thing for my mind is to say, so what are the skills we want people to have that are going to go through training? Now, that's segmented into, are they going to be talking to the media? They're going to be talking to adults. We keep on talking about science communication for adults. I don't know why people just think that science communication is something for adults. That kind of rolls out that way. And if you talk below for kids, it somehow is it's in the K-12 classroom. Kids only spend 3% of their lives in the K-12 classroom. So there's a whole lot of other time to get to the youth besides in the K-12 classroom. So we need to think about, so it's not only what are the skills, but then who are the audiences, and maybe you want to segment that. But what are some base skills? There's some really fundamental skills, whether you're talking to an adult, you're talking to a child, you're talking to the media. They're absolutely critical, so maybe that's what should be focused on. But it's really deciding what that should be. I think, so that's one thing about what that should be, but then I think this whole delivery, so great, I learned the skills, but now I have no mechanism by which to go out and do anything. I don't know schools to get to, I don't know museums, whatever it may be. What's the infrastructure that's set up, whether it's through the professional organizations, through museums, through universities. Lots of universities have education outreach program. So I think if there's anything, there are numbers of groups out there that are doing this. And so how do we bring them together? We really need a network of networks. So I think this group, because of where it's placed, and the fact that it does have a lot of these, I don't know if the professional societies consider themselves a network, but I think it's a fair statement. We have a lot of these networks already, including Compass, that exist. So what is it about getting those people together so that you can develop strategies? And these strategies don't necessarily take a lot of money. Maybe you need some money to bring people together, but they all have ongoing programs. Of course, they're all looking for money too, but still. So I think that's an important element of, and maybe that's learning. Someone just brought up the whole issue of learning more information, but I think for me, those are the two things. If you really want to have, if the goal, which at least when I got into this, the goal was there should be more scientists communicating with public audiences. Now that public audience might be very different. And if that's true, that infrastructure to connect the public audiences to the scientists and the scientists' ability to communicate effectively are the two fundamental things, and it kind of shows up in the money. Those were the two top money items. So I think that if there's action items, it's what are the core competencies and how do you develop this? I like the term infrastructure because it's not always boundary. Sometimes it's not boundary organizations. It could be other kinds of groups too. What's the process to facilitate that?
Okay, Andrew had something in.
So I'm interested in that statistic about 3%, K through 12 students spending 3% of their time in classroom. And in interest of full disclosure, when I was in K through 12, I'm sure I spent less than 2% of my time in a classroom. I think the money question is an interesting one, because, particularly for a meeting in Washington, because of course money in Washington is only measured by the delta. So if you're not going up, then it's a disaster. And even the NIH discussion, we have to reflect upon that. You're still talking about whatever it is, $26 billion annual science enterprise. But if you talk to anyone, there's no money for research anymore. It's just in total collapse because it's not going up. And much the same for NSF and so on. And that's true in many organizations. But realistically, we're still spending quite a lot of money, whatever he said, $450 billion on a research and development enterprise in the country, crossing government, private, and private sectors. And that means that we can do a much better job of communication. But it strikes me that a lot of this discussion is trying to set infrastructure, and I believe that that's important. But Amanda, you also noted that foundations tend to focus on issues, and there's a pretty good reason for that. It's because that's how your strategies form and how you get people excited about a particular problem. It's not about the infrastructure problems, And so one possibility is to try to take a well-defined set of science and let's say societal issues, and try to create communication around those issues in a particular way. So you can use lots of different models depending on what the issue is. It can be the working group model that I suggested before, where instead of getting people to synthesize the information, you're figuring out how you can communicate it out, but on an issue focus. Carrying into it many of the best practices that you've seen in other places. Another one can be an extension model for something different from the usual approach for extension models, where you're putting communicators together with researchers in a partnership, trying to learn some of the lessons from extension. And another can be from science societies, which have a particular cachet and authoritativeness and have access to many members and can serve that convening role. But using an issue focus to try to build the infrastructure, as opposed to just hoping that we can create this broader set of infrastructure, might be a way to move beyond what I think we're largely doing now, which is people are trying experiments in many different places, creating science communications institutes, training scientists, doing it well, but in a very fragmented form, not really trying to do it nationally. And I would say that issue focus, Compass was extremely successful at that in marine issues, and that was the formation of Compass, which, again, full disclosure, I was involved in for a long time. And that issue focus helped define the organization as well as create the structure. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that, the value of trying to take that approach.
And to follow up on something you said a little earlier too, two scientists have 5 different opinions. I think it's, and that can be all too true when you're reporting on it. But I think that part of this communications training, science is exciting and it's dramatic, and people do have different points of view. And I mentioned this before in different roundtable contexts. It's fascinating to me how many scientists, sometimes I'll get 2 or 3 of them, talking background, and we're setting up for a story or a show, will be almost at each other's throats over difference of opinion. They respect each other usually, and then you get them on, out in the public, and they just clam up. And I think training not only the scientists, but also, the minders of the scientists, the people that want the message to be focused and all of that. And I don't know how Bill feels about that from a business standpoint, but, being able to have these debates and let scientists, again, most people who go into science have a reason, and they're passionate about what they do, at least hopefully if they're in it for a while. And it may or may not be an issue per se, but they have strong opinions. And we have famous debates throughout history actually about this. And that's where it gets exciting. It's almost like, drama or watching a movie. And I think teaching scientists that it's okay to do that, and then that's part of the process. And in doing so, you teach the public a very fundamental truth, which is that science isn't monolithic, except in a few cases maybe. We don't know everything about everything or any particular topic, and it's going to change, and there are differences of opinion among credible scientists. So anyway, Amanda, you had a comment. I think we were talking about funding, but shifting more over into infrastructure, but what?
I think the discussion is free form and,
exactly.
and we're having fun. So I want to build on what Andy was saying a bit and go back to Brooke's point about how hard it is to fund some of this stuff. Thinking about something as basic as implementing communications trainings, particularly say for graduate students. Boy, everybody gets behind that, everybody likes it, but there's, I think, often a disconnect between what this community sees as priorities and goals and what the institutions that have the money to spend will see as priorities and goals. And so it's that issue-focused institutions versus this infrastructure problem, and how do we match this up? So I think it's a big challenge, and I'm not sure how to solve it. And Brooke keeps coming to me, he's like, "Well, you're funny. You should figure this out." And it's you should have the answers, right? And sadly, I don't. And
Wait, you don't?
I don't. Yes, I am a representative of a foundation. I say we do not have all the answers.
Brooke.
I don't get in trouble.
Yeah,
Brooke has all the answers.
No, I have lots of questions for you guys. To follow up on what Amanda and Andy were just saying, Andy, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, which I hate to do, but moving towards more focusing on issues to do this, I'm afraid would more deeply entrench the problem that we're in, which is we've already been doing it a little bit issue by issue, and what that risks now is that we're reinventing the wheel, and when science is communicated around these things, it's associated with an agenda. And I feel like what we've done, and what I feel really good about, is that this meeting feels like it's coming at the right time, because there's infrastructure that's been bubbling up for different reasons and different purposes, and some of it might be around some issues and some of it might be around different issues. And I think what's really needed to help the goals we've been talking about here about science and scientists getting out there is to actually invest in and parts of the infrastructure that benefit the whole, not just one piece of it. And I worry if we take that on issue by issue, we're going to entrench our existing challenge.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. I think I know why you're saying that, but what I'm thinking about in issues is I'm thinking about large-scale societal problems, not science issues or immediate policy issues. And so there are, if you wanted to do this around some areas of environmental science about how you communicate risks and challenges, or how do you, mitigate risk, as opposed to, let's figure out how you address overfishing, or I'm not talking about issues at that level. I'm just worried that if you try to create a big infrastructure all at once, that it will be built and hoping people will come, and that's not necessarily the way that people shape their careers. And so I think we could redefine the set of problems and try a bunch of models where we already have some information. We've already had some. So we should have some good data on what works, and what might not work, and what could be adapted. But bite off things with some issue focus, at least in broad scale areas. But I appreciate the problem of straying into advocacy is part of what you're addressing, and of course my organization has to wrestle with that all the time, because we are an advocacy organization, but science-based one. And I think it can be done.
Yeah. I think Martin had his hand up for a while there.
So I had lots of thoughts, so I have to contain myself a little bit. I want to go back to the low-hanging fruit question that we had early on and build on what Dennis said about some of the things that are maybe more immediate low-hanging investments into infrastructure, both intellectual as well as infrastructure in more of community component. But before I say that, I want to go back to a question somebody had asked before, I think it was you, Brooks, which is, do we face a fundamental problem, or do we want to improve on the margin what we're already doing? I'm still not clear. It seems to me that we are trying to improve on a fundamental way in some pockets, but other than that, we're trying to get better at what we do already to a large degree. That said, three things I want to mention. One is kind of community building exercise. And as an example, I want to bring something in that Dennis knows quite a bit about, which is the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, and investment that NSF is making into this informal environment, which is interesting because this is a community that didn't know it existed. It's where you invest because people live in different areas of something that some people saw as an intellectual community, but most people didn't. And so the idea that you invest strategically into a hub that brings people together, brings the resources together, brings communities together to discuss issues of common interest, and expands the pie is an interesting strategy that I'm very supportive of, that NSF made in order to form a community and professionalize it. And I think something similar is now in the works for science communication, broadly speaking. So it's a low-hanging fruit of something that's already in the works, not to hang out too much, but there have been discussions for professional societies are involved in this, and it might live somewhere over there at AAAS, and there might actually be a journal coming out or a magazine, and so on and so forth. So that's an investment into an infrastructure that allows people at various stages of their career and at various affinity to this kind of project, as from science communicator to scientist who occasionally use this, to find a home. And that's one thing I want to mention. That's an infrastructure more as a community infrastructure. Two intellectual infrastructures I want to mention. One is actually, you said that, Brooke, which is there are many goals that people have for doing this. I find myself constantly in fruitless discussions about this. Are we trying to find new audiences, old audiences, this way, that way? It's useful to have a document people can reference where you say, let's not have this discussion. Here is what this looks like, the landscape of this. Let's stop having this discussion. Let's move on and say, I'm in this quadrant of this whole thing. So it is actually useful to invest into these kinds of intellectual infrastructures, whether it's a booklet, a workshop that's based on, and then has something that comes out of it, but something people can reference and stop having fruitless discussions that are déjà vu all over again. That said, there's another thing. Dennis mentioned that we know, and actually then I think Andrew was saying this as well, there's quite a bit we know that actually works, but there is no authoritative way of referencing this in the sense of, other than referencing all sorts of things. So it's actually useful to have potentially some authoritative work on the science of science communication that basically then concludes with, here are really the things that we know yes work and the things we know yes don't work, based on the various literatures which are not just in communication, they're in social psychology, and all sorts of places. And bringing that together would be a useful intellectual infrastructure investment that would help the community just as much as the one that looks at the community building itself. Those are the small things I wanted to bring in as low-hanging. I see these as truly low-hanging fruit.
No, I think that's really interesting. You know, we don't have any way to rate this information, you know, what works, what doesn't, you know, how these different styles. It reminds me of, I've been working on some stories on toxicology, and there's so many agencies in the federal government, at the state level, everything, they impart the exact same information, but it's done in very different ways, and sometimes it's incomprehensible to me, sometimes it's very well written, and it's not always the same. So, you know, maybe we have, in some cases within the infrastructure that exists, there's actually overkill, and there are too many people. And these hubs you're talking about, I don't know if that's what you meant, but one interesting way for us in the public would be to have scientists come together and maybe have a slightly different infrastructure where those structures that have been set up already are working a little better in tandem. Anyway, Amanda, then Bill.
What you just said got me thinking about what we're doing in another area in climate adaptation. One of our grantees, called EcoAdapt, started the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, also known as CAKE. But this is a place for documenting case studies of what is this community or this group trying for climate adaptation, and how is it working? Because this is, again, similarly a rapidly emerging field. Not a lot of information there, a lot of duplication of effort in terms of trying to develop climate adaptation strategies in various places. And so this is a central clearinghouse where you can go and find out what people are trying on issues that are similar to yours, or share your story of what's working. And I'd be fascinated in doing something like that for science communication, because the Sackler colloquium was amazingly eye-opening for me, not being familiar at all with the social sciences. It was very interesting, but as you pointed out, sometimes scientists who are studying science communication are not necessarily good about sharing that information with those of us who want to try to use it. So is there a way to bridge that gap?
Well, those are a couple of things that I think the roundtable should really focus on. That it's doable for us, as sort of advisors to talk about the things that are out there already. We're talking about infrastructures. Well, there are a lot of infrastructures in place, as we've mentioned. Some are doing better than others, but what's working and what's not? And I know some of you study that, and we could feed that in, but just making those simple connections, and also what's out there. I mean, it's really crazy as a journalist. There's just not, especially in science. I mean, when you get into the business world, sometimes you do a little better job of cataloging things because they're trying to sell you things and they want to differentiate themselves and explain it. But it's hard to figure out even who's doing what. And I've done some studies in my own small academic work, at the NIH, giving grants to the exact same thing over and over again without really paying any attention to the fact that 3 other people already did similar projects, and I either worked or they didn't, but nobody's talking to each other. And that alone, I mean, if you could set up a process for better collecting information on that and having some way to understand what's working or not, that could be in the purview of what we're doing here, to make suggestions along those lines. And I don't think that would require a vast amount of funding either to set up a process like that. Right?
Yeah, great conversations. I just want to add to it that I guess getting back to sustainable infrastructure, where I get a growing concern, I guess, listening to the dialogue is, if we don't deliver a result from what we're doing, if we go out there and just put better communication processes in place and we're just training the same people or training people who then don't engage the public, right, we're not delivering a result. We could create a lot of boundary organizations that go out there and we have a lot of good things happening, but if they don't engage the public and do something, we don't get the result. So it's how do we pull the collection of things together in a way that doesn't necessarily pick a policy or pick a topic, I don't care what it is, but at least picks a process of combination of these factors that delivers a result. And the result can be diffuse across many programs, but it's got to have a result. And my fear is we don't get there, we're never going to, it's not going to be sustainable. You'll go, it's like the NSF example. We fund something, one thing, we're done with that, we're moving on. I mean, it's got to be something that refunds itself, that continues the momentum.
Yeah.
That Erica.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, it's just a comment to this last point, which is that I think that this speaks to the need to invest in a parallel infrastructure in monitoring and evaluation to understand whether or not the investments that you're making are generating the return on investment that you think you're making and would like to see happen. And so I think in terms of research needs, one of the big things that came out of our workshop on graduate science communication training was that this is a huge outstanding need for being able to understand and evaluate best practices in communication training. And so I think that any sustainable infrastructure would have to have that as a core component of it.
Yeah.
So just to lead off from what Martin was talking about with potential journal or place for people to be able to come together. As I reflect back on my career, I have attended 2 meetings in my entire career that brought people together across a wide range. The first was one that was held at NIST back in the mid-90s. That was one that you applied for. I forget the name of it. I still have the book on my shelf. But it brought together TV producers and journalists and museums and people doing web work. So very, very cross-disciplinary. And the other was the first...
2001, Best Practices in Science Communication was a peer-reviewed conference at NIST.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Gail and I co-organized that.
That's right. So there was that meeting. That was, I thought, a really profound experience. The other was the first case meeting before they closed it down to just NSF PIs. So as much as case is a great thing, it's really hard if you don't have an NSF grant to benefit from that. So as much as, Andy pointed out earlier about the interest in what wasn't up on the board, and one of the things that I found interesting at this group is the people that aren't in the room. Because there are a lot of, there's a pretty wide representation here, but at the same time, Dennis is sort of doing dual duty as museums, which is huge group. There's the Science Festival, there's a Science Cafe organized. There's a lot of groups that aren't represented here that, and I think when we talk about trying to get down to thinking about goals or specific impacts, I think it's not really worth worrying about what the individual projects are, because we're all going to be different. Some are going to be short-term, some are going to be long-term. We all have different audiences. We are going to be talking in circles forever there. But I do think an important differentiation that was brought up earlier today between communicating about science versus communicating or PR about institutions is probably an important differential to make. And making sure that we're focused on communication about science is really, it has to be a vital understanding and agreement, I think, of the people in the room. Otherwise, it does get just, the goals are probably perhaps just too broad when you bring together those wider groups.
Yeah. Yep.
Keegan, how much was in the biggest pot? How many coins? 64?
64.
So if those were $1 million coins, and that would be $64 million, we spend that much in the life sciences community every year on media training alone. We spend that money on media training, though, because we are preparing institutional spokespersons, not science spokespersons. And to get to Brooke's point, if we were to redirect those dollars into science communication as opposed to institutional spokesperson training, I think that's a good place to sort of think about how that goes. On the other hand, that creates a situation where the institutions who are spending the money do this altruistically, and as we know, altruism is not a sustainable model.
Yeah, Martin.
Reminds me of the profound stuff I wanted to say, which is probably not profound, but just trivial. But that has to do with something you actually said about broader, and it has to do with broader impacts and the question of, are we making a difference? There's the idea, and completely as a former evaluator, I'm with you, Erica, on the idea that good projects need to have evaluations to see their effectiveness. I'm on the record for that. The other question is whether collectively we make an impact. And I want to bring the idea up that we said, well, there's all this education and communication going on, and still 2/3 of the American public, are kind of either in a religious perspective or completely reject the idea of human evolution. The question is, what would have happened without any of this? And it's the war on poverty is a great example. 19% poverty rate under Johnson when he declared it, now 15%. What without the war on poverty would it be now? Yeah. Is a question that sometimes people say, well, okay, let's do the sea urchin removal experiment. How is the seagrass growing when you take the sea urchins out? So what would the world look like? We're oftentimes in this defense mode where we say we can show that things on the overall are getting so much better, but nobody also shows just how they would look like if all of this didn't exist. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind in our narrative about the value of a community. That this is a component of our work that we're doing, that we're just keeping, it's like the frog in the milk. It gets cooked. You want to hop out of this, but you have to make sure you make butter first. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
It's like we didn't have a depression. I kept us from having a depression, but
yes. I want to mention
how do you prove that?
That just because the needle doesn't seem to be moving isn't a sign of failure.
Right.
It might be a sign of success.
But, I think as I'm listening to all this, it really is coming back to, we do have a wealth of things that are happening that are, I think all of us would agree are working, many things that aren't. Part of what I'm hearing is we need to group these together and start talking about them and understanding them, and I know some of you, again, are doing that already, but getting the message out to those who are in charge of spending the money on communication. To me, as a person that's being communicated to, I start getting the institutional message or the company message. I tune out. as a journalist, that's not what I want to hear. I go to somebody at the NIH or even to DuPont to find out about the science, at least because I'm a science reporter. And, even that simple message, hey guys, that's what works. Describing, the science, not these other messages that you have. And, a way to collect that or try to, make that part of the way that we train people, I think, could be very valuable. And it seems to me that there's a vacuum here where people, there are, thousands of different efforts going on that aren't entirely paying attention to each other. Any others? I mean, we've had a couple tweets about the idea of top-down or bottom-up infrastructure, and we do keep, this is a meeting on infrastructure. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, should we be, when you talk bottom-up, you're usually talking about toppling whatever's there. I mean, is the infrastructures that exist, or do they need to be just tweaked? Do they need to be totally overhauled? What do people think?
I guess this sort of fits into that category. It's something I'm trying to figure out exactly what my comment is, but it's this sort of worry that I feel like I have at a lot of these sort of meetings, whether it's about communications or education or whatever, that we have a room full of people who are sort of committed to this, but the thing that's really needed for this sort of sustainability is as we've talked about, the sort of the cultural change, which I think includes the sort of rank and file scientist. And I think if we ask people, everybody says that that's important, but it's always somebody else's problem. So training and having these abilities to match people up, I think all those things are great. But I guess I'm skeptical whether sort of the average scientist out there who's interested in this is going to feel like it's part of their responsibility to help do this in some fashion, whether that's be an active participant or at least be an active supporter and making sure it happens around them. And that partly relates to the sort of the top-down, bottom-up thing, because I'm not sure that we've really addressed that much that sort of, how do we have the sort of groundswell of support within the community so that we can start sort of bringing people on board, not just doing good things.
Are people feeling there's a bottom-up going on in science? I mean, I can tell you that certainly on the West Coast where I am, this do-it-yourself science and biology, I read about life sciences, that's becoming an enormous movement. Quantified self, where you're using technology to measure every, genetics and everything else. I don't see there being yet a real bottom-up, top-down meeting of the minds, but I don't know if there's some other areas. Yeah.
Well, actually, I think there's a lot of bottom-up as it relates to training for scientists. I know of a lot of universities where graduate students are getting together and they're actually developing their own courses. I think what's happening in a lot of professional society is really a bottom-up. That's people who are interested in education have gotten together and have education sections. Certainly, I'm involved with the American Astronomical Society, and it really started that way. So I actually think a lot of this, maybe even the majority of it, has started as a bottom-up rather than somebody saying you're going to do education.
Yeah.
Although you have NSF who is saying you're going to do education.
Do Amanda and then Andrew.
I think the case for the groups of scientists that I work with most frequently, conservation biologists and ecologists, it's very much a bottom-up thing. Most of these people are pretty passionate about making sure their work has impact. They want to talk about it. And particularly those scientists that are outside academia. I mean, there's a lot of great scientists talking about their work in academia as well, but the incentive and reward structure is different, and there's a self-selection process as well for scientists that choose to work for agencies, NGOs, and I would imagine the same is true in the business setting as well. We're talking about your work as part of your job. It is not an add-on or an ancillary thing like it can be in an academic setting, but it is a fundamental part of your job for a scientist at an environmental group, for example. And so there is a very much a bottom-up demand. And the second thing that I was saying is that there's a lot of scientists out there, and yes, we need a culture shift, but we don't have to reach everybody. It doesn't have to be a monumental culture shift, and I'm not anticipating that we're going to transform every scientist into a good public speaker and a ardent supporter of good science communication. If we could get 10%, that would probably do the trick.
No, I think that's really true. Let me do Andrew and then Erica. Would
I
you?
wanted to build off of her just kind of briefly.
Okay,
Just very-
sure. Go ahead.
Just briefly, I thought one thing Amanda just mentioned is the scientists that are not in academia, and actually if you look at the stats now, it's way less than 50%, I think in some fields 20% that are going to stay in academia. And so we do put a lot of emphasis on let's train these people that are in research universities, put all this money into research universities, when in fact, I'm speaking myself as a scientist that is outside of academia, there's a lot of scientists that aren't in there, and it isn't interesting to think about that sector of people.
There's a big debate about that, actually. You know, we're training so many people to be academic scientists, but the numbers of academic scientists, at least a percentage, are getting much smaller. Andrew?
I'm not sure I agree with training them to be academic scientists. We're training them to be scientists in academia. And
is there a
many
difference?
of them, yeah, there is a difference, because that doesn't mean they stay in academia. It's just
Well, that's maybe what I meant. Maybe you articulated it better. But yes.
And what I was going to, some of this builds off of what Amanda said, but goes to the bottom-up and top-down question overall. First of all, I don't think that we're expecting that every scientist is now going to, learn to and be a communicator. In fact, there's a lot of people I really wouldn't advise that you let anywhere near a microphone reporter or anything else. And fundamentally, if somebody doesn't want to do that as part of their career, they shouldn't. So it is, but that's different from having a cultural change where science is brought into a broader sphere than just the academic literature. Because it's not that you should only go and talk about your own work. Hopefully you're communicating, and many organizations do, communicate around a large body of work, not just the stuff that you author yourself. And we shouldn't confuse that. On the bottom-up and top-down question, I think what doesn't make any sense is to have a top-down mandated kind of controlled structure. I don't think anyone would imagine that would really work. There is an awful lot going on bottom-up of people who want to do this and need to have better structure to help them to get outside of their narrow field, outside of their own results in some cases, to be speaking to the broader set of issues. And of course, a lot of that is happening in many fields, including climate science and other places. And all of that is a very good thing, but it would be extremely useful to have more infrastructure that facilitates, rewards, and supports that. Again, I'll go back to the science integrity policy examples. Having something from funding agencies, whether they be governmental or non-governmental, and that's not just NSF and NIH, but also all the applied science agencies, that said, our grantees are considered to be covered under a scientific integrity policy too. And that means that their institutions, by accepting this grant, agree that they can speak out, because people were saying there are barriers within the institutions, and that they will reveal conflicts of interest and do all of those sorts of things that should be done. And ultimately, that's the same thing that you would hope starts to come through from private sector research and development, and that goes to the trust issues again. And those things are maybe top-down, but they're not instructing people, you must be a communicator and this is how you're going to do it. They're facilitating people who want to do the work that we're talking about.
All right. Okay, a couple more. Yes.
Sorry, I have to completely disagree with your statement of not having everybody be a communicator. Every scientist should be, and if we're talking about changing the culture, we have to change that mindset that some are good and some, oh, that guy, hide him away in the corner. Not every scientist should be up on the Hill advocating for budget increases for the federal agencies, but people have different strengths. And if the mindset within the scientific culture is that science communication is part of your job as a scientist, that's how you get the culture change. We're not trying to get everybody to be a communicator. We're trying to make communication a part of the scientific process. And I think that's the mindset that we have to go with. And that's what I go with when developing courses and programs for my membership. There's a wide range in terms of skills of people who, some are really good, some are really bad, but my job isn't to say, okay, you who are really bad, sorry, we're leaving you behind. We're just focusing on the cream of the crop. It's got to be everyone across the scientific community.
Well, there are lots of ways to communicate, too, in different audiences. I mean, obviously, everybody has to, at some level, communicate, at least maybe with a guy on the next bench over. Excuse me, I have to get around you. But I think part of the point that we're bringing away here is, and we talked about this, the different audiences. And, you may, and you all may not be that far off on that. I mean, certainly you're not going to bring out some guy who can barely say his name in public and just simply will always be that way. You're not going to take him up to the hill to testify, or somebody that's going to, throw Molotov cocktails at the gentleman up there. You're, I mean, not literally. I didn't mean to say that literally. Verbal. But, I think you have a lot of different communication styles, and that needs to be incorporated into the discussion. So we have actually hit a moment here. Anybody have anything they're burning to say before we have Brooke come back up and close us out here? I think we had a great discussion. Okay, in the back.
I would just say the thing about all scientists. The thing about all scientists, or some scientists. Some scientists not being good communicators or whatever. I found as a long-time journalist that those people, scientists included, who aren't the, quote, great communicators, are the ones who will just innocently tell me how things are. So, please.
We love those people, don't we? Could you say that a little louder into my microphone? Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And anyway, I think with that, I want to thank our panelists, and actually you all too. I think it's been an interesting discussion, and I'm going to put my gold on Brooke's idea here. I think that was a great idea. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.